Suspense. Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here. Aren't we all happy that we're inside? Because look out there. The storm has arrived. And the air conditioning works. Life is good. How many of you are joining us for the first time this evening? Okay, awesome. Well, please come back. The Center for Fiction, if you don't know, is a 200-year-old cultural nonprofit whose mission is to encourage people to read and value fiction and to support and celebrate its creation and enjoyment. And we do this through public events like this one, reading groups, and writing workshops, all offering vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joy of story. Our Kids Read program offers immersive reading experiences for children, and we support early career writers with our First Novel Prize and our Emerging Writers Fellowship. Visit our site, sign up for our mailing list, and follow us on social media. And to support our work for creating a home for readers and writers here in Brooklyn, consider becoming a member so you're tuned in to all of our activities. And come back and see us soon. For example, in this very room, next Wednesday, July 24th, we have an event with Tracy O'Neill and Padma Vishwanathan to celebrate their new books, which blend the detective genre with memoir. I think that if you're interested in memoir writing, it should be a really interesting conversation. A couple of logistics for tonight. If you are here in the room, if you have a question during the Q&A, please raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring you a microphone. That's so that the guests who are watching on the live stream can hear you as well. And if you're joining us on the live stream, you may type your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll read those to the room before we break for the signing line. Ayşegül was kind enough to pre-sign books, and we'll also be doing a personalization line after the event, just on the other side of this wall. I'll come back and give you information on how that will work at the close of the conversation. And now for the main event. We're here tonight to celebrate Ayşegül Savaş, the anthropologist. As I'm sure all of you know, this is why you're here. It only takes a page or two of reading to understand why she has such a devoted readership. Joining her in conversation is the wonderful Adam Dalva. Please welcome them both to the stage.
Hi. Can you hear me? And can you hear Ayşegül?
Hello.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming out on, I see now it's a thunderstorm, and so there's been developments since we were upstairs. This is one of my favorite books of the year, and before we have a quick reading from it, I should just say that this is a huge honor for me because I think Ayşegül is one of the very great writers of our generation. And all your novels, your short stories, your essays are fantastic, and this joins them in the pantheon. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read very briefly from the novel, just to give you a sense of why the book is called The Anthropologists and sort of the organizing framework. I should also tell you that I did not come up with the title, but my agent did. She's here tonight, and she's a genius. Anthropology. My last year at university, one professor of anthropology trained our attention inward at the close of every lecture. The professor looked wizened beyond age and seemed perpetually troubled by the world, which made me inclined to take her teaching seriously. She asked us to notice that just life, writing papers, going to parties, applying to jobs, could always be mapped out following the structures we learned about in class. Friday night blackouts and graduations and hockey games, the cigarettes we bummed off one another outside the library. All these were the unspoken foundations of our society, whose rules we had perfected so as not to think of them as rules, but as the smooth tracks of life. From time to time, the professor would ask us to imagine an anthropologist observing the everyday routines with which we had set up our lives. They might be arbitrary or essential, but they were rules to a game nonetheless, one which gave an illusory sense of harmony and permanence. The first time she brought up the imaginary anthropologist, I visualized a tiny Martian in a safari outfit, taking notes on a flip chart. But even with the absurd image, the point was clear. The imaginary anthropologist remained with me after I finished university. I would summon her to narrate the simplest interactions when I tried to untangle the layers of an argument, when I edited footage, when I was dressing up for an event. I called on the anthropologist to examine our lives as we moved from place to place where we were never natives. What would she write down in her pad if asked to study Manu and me as a tribe of our own? Trained as she was to identify the ways of people rooted in their homes, their language and customs, what would the tiny anthropologist point to in our makeshift apartment, where we lived without a shared native tongue, without religion, without the web of family and its obligations to keep us in place? What would she identify as our rituals and ties of kinship, the symbols that constitute a sense of the sacred and the profane? Because it often seemed to me that our life was unreal, and I summoned the anthropologist to make it seem otherwise.
I love the image of the tiny Martian in that section. And as you were reading, and as I read this, it had me thinking that you, Ayşegül, are sort of the tiny Martian for these characters. And maybe to start, I wonder what drew you to these two characters who are sort of leading the book, and what is the anthropology you're kind of studying of them?
So the two people, the book is narrated by Asya, who's a documentary maker, and she's making a documentary of a park in the city where she lives. And in parallel to this, she and her husband Manu are looking for a place, a home to buy. And they think that every home that they without religion and without family and without any traditions, they sort of think anything could go. Like, we could live in the suburbs, we could live in the city center. I mean, I guess I was drawn to this idea just because I recently realized, and this was like dumb to realize so late, that I just write about people who are foreigners to their settings. And I was like, oh, that's my subject. So I guess it's sort of obvious why this book is about a couple who are trying to figure out. And it's no secret that I think this is the most autobiographical work that I've ever written. It happened in a time when I was at the threshold of adulthood, and I felt very sad about having to abandon my youth and my childhood. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to write a book that that sort of commemorates that time in life, that like very brief period of being young and being without responsibility, being, not a parent, not a homeowner, still curious enough to have long, hypothetical, philosophical discussions, and not jaded by those sorts of things.
So I think that sadness really codes, especially in the second half of the book, as a kind of nostalgia for the lives they're currently living. And nostalgia is at once a happy and a sad emotion, and very complex. I don't know if you remember, but the first time we met in person, you said you'd done something very strange. You'd written a book about happy people. And so they are experiencing a lot of sadness, but part of their sadness is because they've been happy. And
Yes.
they kind of remain happy. And I don't think I've read many books where characters who are happy remain happy. So I was wondering if you might talk about that.
I mean, somehow, like, it's not allowed in literary books that you write a happy book. So I thought, like, surely there needs to be some drama. And one of the starting points for me when I was writing, when I started writing The Anthropologist, was I want to write about a couple who love one another, full stop. Like, not love one another and then there's this huge misunderstanding, love one another, there's tragedy, which is sort of the setup for romance, but who just love one another and are happy. And I guess this was one of the big challenges for me. Is one allowed to do that? And if so, how do you make that a compelling book if there is not the drama of the love drama of, there is something being at stake for their relationship? There are big things at stake, like existentially, how should they live? What should their culture be? And will they ever feel a sense of belonging? But for them, it's, it's not a question of like, will we remain together?
And they also, I think, fill some of those drama voids, and your novel does too, because they love to gossip about the other people in their lives. There's one great moment where they're waiting for her friend from college to leave town so they can gossip about her after she leaves and kind of unpack. And so again, like that engine that's really driving the book, their relationship, they love, and I think you might also love, to kind of talk about the people who kind of cross the path of their lives. And this book, for such a short book, is incredibly dense with supporting characters.
They're big rehashers. And it's, I guess that also, I mean, I was interested in really how does one get to the texture of everyday life? And how can I write a book that is truly about daily life, the joys of daily life, and somehow, not that be a shopping list, have there be some, interest for the reader in reading. And so obviously I was thinking about my own life. I was asking many friends who aren't rooted in place or in culture, what sort of their traditions are and what their daily life looks like. Yeah.
So traditions. She is, both she and her husband are not native to the country they're living in. They themselves don't have a lot of traditions that they connect with in the area. And so she is very engaged with like tradition making herself, and almost like fanatic about it, fanatic about making a rhythm of traditions. She herself is a list maker. She wants to make lists of all the traditions she'll have in her next life. And I wonder if you might talk a bit about the sort of displacement that she has, and then the way tradition might help her fill that void.
I mean, it's both very abstract and very specific, right? Because tradition is such a specific thing, and yet the book happens in an unnamed city. We don't really know where Asya and Manu are from. I have such a hard time coming up with like geographically nondescript names, and whenever I hear one, I'm like, yes, next character. And so I guess I was really interested in their traditions, but also making it abstract, like have them be the types of traditions that many people living in away from their native lands, or even like just away from home where they were born, where they feel a sense of foreignness, might practice, and to turn tradition from something that's culturally rooted, societally practiced, to something that's practiced like, the tiny Martian would observe, something that's practiced by a family of two, this couple, who are trying to make a life for themselves, and to sort of cast an anthropological gaze at their traditions, which their traditions aren't like celebrating big holidays, but are things like getting drinks with their best friend Ravi. And this is something also that was the funnest part of writing the novel. When I was doing the field work for the novel, I just go around asking people like, so what are your traditions? And people would say, like this show we watch on Fridays when we order pizza, or like morning coffee. And I wanted to look at those sorts of daily activities as traditions, as like things that are routine and yet have a sense of sacredness about them.
I want to follow you down the fieldwork path in a second, but you mentioned abstraction, so I'm going to start there. Lovers of your work, I think we often talk about how there's often an abstracted element in your novels. For example, in White on White, the lead has sort of no body in that book, and what's very abstract is them. But the town and their work is pretty specifically mapped out. Here, there's kind of a vast amount. We don't just know the city they're in, we also don't know their countries of origin. When they go to see a movie, they're seeing a movie that you describe but you don't name. When they're listening to a music by a blind musician, you don't name it. So this book felt very engaged with abstraction, which was very interesting to me because so much of what you just talked about is about specificity. And I wonder if you might talk about that.
I mean, this was a huge question for me writing the novel. Should I just say it takes place in Paris? It's a Turk and a Latvian, who are married and like looking for an apartment to buy, like surprise. But then I thought, yes, like it is obviously based on autobiographical elements. At the same time, once you're through a first draft, you do distance yourself from the manuscript and you say, okay, this is now a world of its own and characters of their own. And I began to see that it wasn't just about my specific autobiographical experience, but a certain experience of young adulthood. And I thought, how can I make this? And the experience of being a Turk in Paris is sort of it's a niche existence, and it's a niche sort of like immigrant story with a very specific political and historical background. And I thought, I want to sort of remove myself from that, have this book be about, what many young people, many freelancers, many people who are sort of like culturally adrift are experiencing, and decided not to give the city a name or not to give them like geographically specific backgrounds.
And does that present like technical challenges when you're drafting?
Well, it does, because like lots of people will say like, oh, you don't say it, but it's Paris. It's like the technical challenge is like this sort of annoying reader who will just because I'm like, no, it's not, because Paris doesn't actually have that many plazas, and you can't really sit and drink in a plaza or like at fountain steps in Paris and and I guess the real, I'm just kidding. I love my readers. Always.
Everyone's like, don't ask a question about this later.
I mean, it's just sort of the easy assumption that the writer has written their life. I have, but then there is a level of abstraction when you write, even when you're writing autobiography. The other, I think, a big technical challenge is making it interesting for the reader, having them not feel like they're in some an airport where everything is so bland, but that it is a specific city, and that it's dynamic, and there is that sort of like energy of life to it. So I mean, I don't know if I've succeeded, but that was the challenge for me.
You've succeeded. Okay, so I wanted to ask about fieldwork, and then maybe we can use that to kind of zoom out to the structuring of the book. She's a documentary filmmaker, and you did fieldwork by talking to your friends, and she is doing a documentary on a park, and every 6, 7, 8, 9 pages, there's a sort of paragraph or two which is just a transcript of a monologue from someone in the park who she's talked to. And I was really moved by this. I was talking with my wife about it before the event, and she said they're kind of her favorite parts of the book, and she's kind of turning the pages to find them because they're these tiny little like pieces of flash almost. And so was that always part of the book, that she herself was going to be doing these interviews, and why did you work them in this way?
I guess it started, she was going to be a documentary maker, and this is really like the craft process of like, here are my characters, what do they do for a living? Do I need to have that be in the book? And then, slowly I discovered when you answer those questions, then you decide how much of that should make it to the writing, how much of that should be sort of hinted at. And then I thought, well, a documentary maker is very interesting because it's, it's a very anthropological gaze. And she's filming a park, and the question, the sort of the guiding question of the novel is, how should one live? And the guiding question of this documentary is, how do people live in the city? Like, who are these people who come to the park? What are their daily lives like? And what are like examples that I can have? And then one big question I had is like, like writers writing about writing, and like writers writing about doing art is possibly I've done enough of that, and possibly also like readers need a break. So I thought maybe not give too much of her process, and it felt a little bit self-indulgent to include those parts, which I did have at some point. And that's why I thought I'm just going to have a scene from the documentary, and also have for that to be a breather, right, from Asia's internal thoughts and all of these like routines that she's describing to us.
In fact, when Asia goes to a museum in this book, no one really likes it, and she has a fight with her friend, and they just kind of leave in a huff, right? Like, it almost felt like you were actually walking away from maybe what people from White on White would expect you to really linger in.
Yes, like the process of making art. And I mean, I also don't mean to, like writers writing about writing is my favorite genre. But it's, it's like writers love that stuff. But I think also personally, possibly I had reached my limit. That I had written quite a lot about the process of making art and the complications of not knowing what to write. This is my first novel. It's sort of like about writer's block and how inspiration and how does one come up with material. So I thought I've examined that and I really mind that. And now how can I just have it be about the artwork itself without this long process of how it comes about.
I love that. So I mentioned those sections. The entire book is in, and if people haven't seen it yet, I'll just hold it. It's in like chapterlets, and all the chapterlets have titles, and they're mostly really short, like 1, 2, 3 pages. And I'm wondering, I mean, there's so much to ask you about how this book is structured. Maybe to start, was this always the structure of the book? Did you always have these titles, and what kind of drew you toward like the titled vignette kind of form?
It didn't always have this book. The sort of the seed of the book is a short story I wrote about a couple looking for an apartment to buy. And it's called Future Selves, and Future Selves is one of the titles that keeps reappearing in the novel. And partly, it's a very solemn story, and besides this framework that's very similar to the novel, and some of the apartments they visit are identical to ones in the story, completely different works. And that novel is about the impossibility of imagining a future for oneself. And this book is about sort of the hope of a happy future. So I really wanted to mentally cut the neural pathways that led me to the voice of the short story, which is very solemn. And so I had to come up with tricks for myself to not think of the narrator of that story. And one way to do it was break it up, have this like sort of ethnographic framework as if these are field notes and titles. And then the shortness of it, there's something about short episodes that gives like naive energy to a work, I think.
And it creates maybe a shocking amount of suspense almost when because you have all these different threads. They go to visit 6 different apartments. We're wondering which one they're going to rent. They have their friend Ravi, who maybe will date one of her friends and maybe not. And you can quickly sort of switch between them. And so the reader's always sort of hoping one of the questions will get answered, and then you ask a different question when they least expect it. So you were talking about adding drama. It seemed like that's the way you got tons of drama into this book.
I have to say, no one has ever said shocking amounts of suspense in relation to my writing.
I was on the edge of my seat. Maybe it's because I love books about renting and buying apartments.
I mean, this is also the thing that you have to your subject matter sort of has to match the structure, right? That if you're writing about having coffee in the morning and these quirky rituals of watching detective series, you really can't have that be an internal monologue, because that tells the reader this is really weighty and it's so serious, and what you get is morning coffee. So you have to sort of teach the reader to read it as something light. Look, these are small chunks that go hand in hand with the smallness of the material, and that is the point of the book. Don't be looking for this big drama that happens.
So this is the only question we set up a tiny bit, but I went to a talk in Paris that you gave a few weeks ago about the episode. And one kind of comp that I wouldn't have naturally thought of for this book that you brought up was the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is told episodically. And I wondered if you might talk a bit more, because I found that talk incredibly mind-expanding, about what draws you to the episodic form, which is one of the oldest forms of storytelling.
This was a huge surprise for me, that the episode, I mean, it's a form that I love and I'm naturally drawn to, and I think that's because of the types of stories I like to tell have this episodic quality, this self-contained quality, rather than, a grand sort of structure. And it is really the oldest form of storytelling. The Epic of Gilgamesh is episodic, all the, Homer is episodic, but you have also, the Canterbury Tales or the 1001 Nights. These are all episodic works, and yet and TV series are episodic, right? And by, the episode is a self-contained piece that has a beginning and an ending. This is what I mean by an episode. So like the show Friends is episodic. You can watch one and it's self-contained. You don't have to watch the entire series to understand what happens. And yet it builds up to something. I'm surprised that it's not so widely used in literature. The fragment is commonly used, and the fragment is not such a happy form, I think, because there isn't the sense of unity when you read one fragment. There's a sense of loss, I would say. So I guess the episode goes with like the happy book that I was describing, and I thought it's like the perfect way to write a happy book is in episodes. And often, like, happy TV series are episodic. Dramas are not, they're resolved within one viewing. I guess that's why I'm drawn to it. I do think there is something, I don't know the answer to this, but we tell stories in episodes, and it's something that comes naturally to us. It's something we've done for thousands of years, and it did come naturally to me writing this book as well.
And it's how children tell stories too, very like compartment.
Yes, and children are episodic storytellers. Rather, they will say, "Oh, today, like, I went to the park. We went on a bus. Like, we saw a giraffe." They'll tell these episodic one thing after the other, rather than, like grand feelings that unite an entire day. So I guess, again, the happiness or the naivete of the book is a little bit, the way a child might tell a story.
Now this is like almost a natural segue with children. I wanted to talk about their parents and her grandmother. One thing that I find, again, this book is very peopled for a short book, and one pressure that is put on them is they seem to have to live like slightly different versions of themselves when her mother comes, when his parents come, when her father comes. And also, she uses technology to talk to her grandmother, who has a medical incident, without ever actually getting to go home and see them. So this idea of like a far-off family and the guilt that provides, but also the way they have to kind of shape themselves to that far-off family, even though they're not with them. That kind of estrangement yet pressure, I wonder if you might talk about, because I thought it was fantastic here.
I mean, this is like one of the very obvious textures of our daily life, that we now are connected to our family through FaceTime. And I thought, like, why not have that be one of the rituals of the book, that she's constantly FaceTiming with her mother or her grandmother, and that sense of both connection and loss. It's both happy, and they're like these little fun chapters where she talks to grandma, but at the same time they're sad because she sees she's away when the grandmother's sick. She sees her mother aging on screen, and these are things we all experience, and that's sort of it, right? There is no bigger drama to that. That is life. And I guess, again, the peopled aspect, our narrative instinct is that then one of those dramas should take over and become the bigger structure of the book. And it actually is very hard to resist that. From having read, as a reader of novels, I was also always thinking, like, should there be a huge crisis in their friendship? But that isn't the specific life I was describing. That isn't the texture. And I had to resist that at every turn and say, one's life is peopled. The people come in and out, and nothing is necessarily resolved. Like, when you're on your deathbed, all your relationships haven't resolved in front of you. They're still, like, ongoing.
I had a technical question for you on this. I have never read a book where characters like successfully argue and then like heal after the argument. And they seem to do it quite often in this book. She'll be like, I'm mad at him and I've stored up some stuff, but I'm actually not that mad. Or
Yes.
We're mad at our friend Ravi, but we'll have another drink with him actually, even though how do you write conflict without a disaster?
I mean, and this, again, like, this is a challenge to be truthful to daily life, right? It's not either you have big drama or everyone is happy, and it's like this very sappy narrative of like, you know, we all love one another. It's like a Sesame Street version of how people live. So I thought like, well, what does a couple's fight look like? It's not like after every fight you say we should get a divorce, or like this is over, it's unacceptable. You know, it's like passive aggressive, and then it's like something really small that like triggers the bigger argument, and then at some point someone says like, what are we even arguing about? So I thought like, wouldn't it be fun to write about those, and to for the reader never to wonder like, oh my God, are they going to separate? Like, you just sort of know. When you're telling your friend, we had a fight last night, and like my partner was so annoying, the friend doesn't say, so like, are you going to get a divorce? It's like, wow, that's annoying, full stop, let's have another drink.
Maybe that's a good segue into the native tongue section. This is one of the recurring titles in the book is native tongue, and I think this is the second one.
Yes, and I guess because the characters don't share a native tongue, they're from two different countries. The book does investigate what does it mean to have a native tongue with someone with whom you don't share a mother tongue, and how do you create that? We spoke differently to each other when there was no one around, something like a high-pitched mumble. There were years of inside jokes, accumulated personas, and mispronunciations. We had nicknames for each other, words with no meaning in any dictionary. That was how we came to claim our own language, a native union, rather than two people speaking to each other in a foreign tongue. We would have been self-conscious if anyone heard us speak like this, like characters in a cartoon, but we weren't embarrassed of each other. And we had a name for the two of us, the T's, short for a word we'd invented more than a decade ago, which signified two people who were in love, who were a little sad, a little misfortunate, who had always been somewhat clumsy and lonely. This was our name for who we were, and it was with great tenderness that we noticed the quality of being a T in others and bestowed on them our own title.
Beautiful. So this idea that you have a line in the book, the other person was my native tongue. And I wonder if you might talk a bit about their experience of living in a language that is not quite their own. She's constantly kind of being spoken to in English, she says, even though she would rather not be spoken to in English. And then forming their own language, but also having to live between languages with their parents, for example. And so there's so much investigation of language, and I wonder if you might talk about language in your work.
Yes, this actually, in terms of abstraction and not naming anything, my brother pointed this out when he read a draft. He was like, you don't name anything. It's totally unbelievable that they're speaking any language but English. So you have to sort of specify that the common language they have and the language that the expats are speaking in this country is English, because that's like the only scenario that makes sense in our world. So that's why they're speaking English. And I thought, okay, like there is no other option. And then besides that, there is, I guess, this idea of having a different persona is obviously connected to what language you're speaking. So Asya has different characters with her family members than she does with Manu, and Manu has a totally different character with his parents and with his brother, and they don't really know about those personas, and they have this extreme eagerness to teach one another, like, oh, we have this like saying, or like we have this inside joke in my language, and of course like it's never going to be as funny, and you're never really going to understand, but they try to adopt that language into their life. And I guess it's quite sad that there is a futility to that effort. And there's also an acceptance that they have, that you can create your own language in English, in your shared foreign tongue, and that it can become unique, and it doesn't have to be like the go-to expat language, and that it can really become specific to the two of you.
There's a scene where Asia's mother-in-law is kind of interrogating her about why she hasn't had a child, and she kind of pretends not to understand the language, even though she kind of does understand it. And so it offers some advantages also in this book.
Yes, exactly. What did you say? Don't know that word.
And there is, so you have another book, you have like 3 books coming out in short measure, but you have another book coming out this year with Transit called The Wilderness, which is an amazing, amazing essay about the 40 days after giving birth. And this book is sort of about the pressure put on a woman of her age before she's decided to have a child. And it's like everything in the book is radiating that pressure on her. Even when they're apartment hunting, people will say, oh, a stroller can fit right up this stairwell. So this felt like a child anxiety book in some ways.
Oh my. Remember I told you, you like always say, this book is actually about...
And I've tried to avoid that.
Yes.
I couldn't help
I
but.
had not realized that, and you're absolutely right. And the two books do go hand in hand in a very ironic way. It is a child anxiety book, also in the sense that that moment of child anxiety, when you're still young, but you won't be young for a very long time, is such a precious time. It's such an anxiety-filled time. And you think, what should I do with my free days? And you know, you might be crippled into inaction, or you might try to value like the long philosophical conversations. And I did, you know, I wrote it right, I think, towards the end of that stage in my life with that extreme love. At a stage, I think, when our really close friends were moving away, and you know, I was nostalgic about our days of being like, of doing nothing and being lazy. And I mean, interestingly, the book about the first 40 days after birth is also an episodic work, and it is, and it tries not to have sort of a grand structure to early motherhood, but just to say it's a lot of different things, and you know, one can't really draw a conclusion, which is what the anthropologist is. You know, it's, you know, this time is a lot of different things, and that's it. No conclusions.
So in this like kind of void of conclusions, she, and to a lesser extent him, are trying to kind of maybe generate a conclusion. And one of those things is the quest for real estate. And there are great novels of like Howard's End. I mean, there are great books about houses. So every 20 pages or so, they will look through an apartment. I wonder like how you actually like design these apartments. You describe them in a fair amount of detail. And you can kind of tell as a reader that that's really the biggest overarching structure of the book, is like these apartments they're hunting for, the pressure to own a house, even though they're going to be like over-mortgaged and horrible, and there's even a scene in a bank where you're like, should they be doing this? And so what is it about real estate that drew you in?
I guess it's a very concrete manifestation of a future life, right? That once you commit to paying a mortgage, that life, the specific life you've committed to, is quite difficult to reverse, especially like after all the bureaucracy and the bank and everything. And if you don't have a clear idea of how to live and what sort of a future to commit to, it becomes more existential. It's not just a house hunt. So I thought, and it's also, I mean, just a good way to structure a novel. They will be viewing these apartments, and at the end of it, maybe they will have found a home for themselves. And then also an obvious way to structure it was to think, well, what are the different options for looking for a place in the city? And then I would, think like the gentrified but really far away neighborhoods, like the nice suburbs, the city center but tiny apartments, the sort of bland in between like residential blocks. So I just described all of those. It was a lot of fun to write and like to invent these homes.
And I like how everyone they visit in those homes is sort of investigating them to say like, what kind of life are you going to build in my space, and how are you going to adapt to it?
And vice versa.
Yeah.
They're looking at these people and thinking, well, this is probably how we'll end up if we get this place.
So
and do we want to end up like that? And there's like nothing wrong with anything they see, but it's so difficult to pick. It could really be anything, and they're constantly wondering, what are our guiding principles in life when we really have nothing in common.
I love when they find out that one of the homeowners was divorced in the house, and everyone's like, I don't know if she should have said that.
Yes, and I mean, weirdly, they're like, oh, like bad energy. But I think they're just coming up with an excuse to not have to make a decision. And every time they decide that a place is not right for them, they're like, like, let's get a drink. Just because like that relief of not having to commit to a life is so joyful.
She keeps ordering drinks when she shouldn't.
Yes, it's a big drinking book. And the mom is like, okay, you know what? I'm going to have one too.
She orders like a vodka soda at 11 a.m. and he's great idea.
My sister-in-law, she has vodka sodas.
Wow.
I've actually never had a vodka soda in my life.
Wow, you're so inventive as a storyteller.
Yeah.
Okay, now beyond the kind of big scale myth making of the apartment, one of my favorite things in the book is there's almost like a chorus of the list she's making of the tiny objects she's going to have in the house. And she's evaluating this list. So I'm going to read the one on page 101 very quickly. Now there was the green jacket, the ceremonial stones, breakfast with Manu, the dame on the terrace, and the shapes of poems. And the list continues to modify after this, and I won't spoil where it goes. So what is it about this list, which is filled with objects and small and specific things? It really felt like an act of storytelling.
It's an act of storytelling, I think, for Asya, because she needs something to aspire to. And the things she has to aspire to, they're not, she doesn't want like the really obvious, or she can't relate to the obvious, like the traditional markers of a future, right? So she doesn't say like, my future looks like 2 children, like 4-bedroom house, like this sort of career. And so the things she has to aspire to are these poetic but totally useless metaphors, like objects that become metaphoric. Like this green velvet jacket she finds in a secondhand store, and she says, I like it, like I should live in the spirit of this jacket. But what is that spirit? It's like sort of cool and sort of old-fashioned. And I like they have an upstairs neighbor with whom they read poems, and she says, I want to retain the sense of, you know, how one feels like when one commits to reading poetry for an entire evening. And says, let that be an item on my list. It's very, very abstract. And it's just, it's a guiding principle for her, even though she doesn't, you know, we don't really know what that life might look like. And I think she doesn't either.
And that upstairs neighbor, Teresa, who I love all her scenes, she's extremely rooted. She's been there for a long time. Her memory is also starting to go, and they're kind of aware that maybe they have too much responsibility for this elderly woman upstairs that they don't actually like have a logistical relationship with. And in some ways, I thought she was the most surprising inclusion in the book. And I wondered if you might talk about her, because I found those parts incredibly poignant.
I guess, I mean, the most obvious way to explain Teresa is that she's their adopted family, and she becomes a godmother figure. And I really wanted to make it not a book just about like young people having drinks, and have an intergeneration. And it is that there is a lot of drinking in the book.
And they drink with her too.
And they drink with her too, except like Teresa like sort of forgets to drink, and they're like, come on, like finish your glass. And just explore in sort of an organic way this idea of, you know, chosen family, and how one builds a community, and how that chosen family not just be young people, but have like a texture of life, and have also, I mean, technically Teresa is the reminder that they will grow old, they will be away from their parents. Their parents will be in Teresa's situation where, you know, they might not have anyone to care for them, and the sort of responsibility that's going to bring to their lives. Like with Teresa, they can be like, oh, you know, like she might have an accident, too bad she lives alone, but then when that happens to their parents, that's a totally different level of anxiety, obviously. And she's also a signifier in that way of the future, I think.
And even when they leave, they feel a sort of responsibility for her. Like they're really rooted in the place. Now, we haven't talked about Ravi, who I think will be a lot of people's favorite character, including mine. So she's looking for like a certain small group of objects, but he is a collector of many objects. He always has a jacket filled with things. My favorite line in the book is you describe his collecting practice as that foggy poetry, which I think is just like sensational. And it's kind of a Three Musketeers book. It's like the two of them and him. And that dynamic, again, is something that I don't see particularly explored. There are books about friendships, but the idea of a couple who kind of share a friend, although he's maybe a little closer with Manu, like, what is it about that dynamic of the three of them that drew you to him? And he's probably the most important secondary character in the book.
He's my favorite character as well. I guess in some ways, Ravi is the person who's most like anarchically resisting like a settled way of life or a mainstream way of life. And he's the one, and because, you know, he's not in a couple, and because he's not, he's quite cool about not belonging, he's the one to show them, guys, it's okay to like be up all night drinking and discussing these questions. It's okay that we don't have a mortgage. It's okay that we don't really know what we're doing with our jobs. And he's constantly resisting those sorts of mainstream narratives. It's also, I mean, I have to say there's an autobiographical element. So it's a friendship. That trio is a friendship dynamic I know well. But you know, there are obviously like couple dynamics I know well, and it was a little bit different from them, because if it's a couple dynamic, then you do have more stable hierarchies or relationships in place. And again, structurally, the fact that Ravi is single constantly poses the threat that one day he is going to settle down, and one day he's going to, you know, leave their trio and, you know, like make a life for himself, which ultimately sort of happens. And that is, I mean, I can't say that it's like a great drama in the book, but it is an element of, it's an element of tension. I think it's honestly, it's an element of heartbreak.
And I enjoyed how they would get very agitated whenever he might go on a date, but they couldn't really admit that to one another. Like, it was such a threat to their dynamic, but they also don't want to be consciously holding him back.
Totally, because they can't be possessive of their life and say like, hey, you know, our entire life and our you know, sense of community like depends on the fact that you remain here and we just like continue drinking until we're old. So they get like really concerned when Ravi like suggests that he will, you know, just not always be part of that friendship. And that's also like constantly questioning Asya and Manu's ways of feeling secure. Well, do they need friends in order to feel at home in the city? Do they need you know, a big community? And can they, like, if Ravi were to move away, and if Teresa were to die, and if the, you know, the expats are sort of annoying, and if the expats just sort of like if they stop hanging out with them, is that still a valuable life?
So one more for me, and then audience, so prepare yourselves. I guess this is the most cheerful last one for me. One element I found fascinating in the book is that there's sort of the idea that there's a disaster yet to come, and they don't know like quite what it is. It's like a sort of Damocles that you never define, and it could be the climate, it could be the death of a loved one. The book is very aware of the fact that this is like a transition point in their lives before whatever huge drama is going to happen. And that felt very conscious and deliberate to me. And it also felt like very reflective of life in 2024. So I wondered if you might talk about that decision.
I mean, first of all, I guess it's like a happy book written by an anxious person. So I couldn't avoid that. But I think there is, like, we do live in our youth, if we haven't experienced great tragedy at an early age, we live with the sense that it's about to come. Like, we're in for it. We'll have to, like, pay back for our happy childhoods and our happy youths and it's inevitable, right? By the death of parents or, well, by the death of parents and of grandparents and by our partners getting sick. So, and then there's like the political climate and the environment. So that sort of like low-level anxiety of like something will happen. We don't know the order. We don't know how we'll deal with it and what that will do to our happiness and to our bond. I just wanted that to be there, and then not say like what that might be. I don't know. The characters don't know either.
Terrific. All right, I think it's time for audience questions, and I think there'll be a wireless mic. Applause in between.
Thank you.
That was unstructured applause. All right, so what questions do you have? There's a mic kind of in the aisle, I see it. There's a question about the third row over here.
Hi, thank you both for doing this event, and Ayşegül, I'm a huge fan of your work, and often with the previous two ones, I feel that it's as much about what's being said on the page as what isn't. There's a sort of haunted quality, and now with this book, you write about it being a happier story, and I was wondering while you were sitting down to write this, if you felt sort of haunted by any other conflicting or chorus voices that were wanting to contribute to the story?
That would make the story more said in some ways.
Yeah, that would add, because with the first two, there's what's being said that you're engaging with as the reader, and then what's not being said but is being felt. And I wondered if you, as a writer, it feels like you name a lot more things specifically, even though there are unnamed cities and unnamed languages. But you, as a writer, feel like I'm going to specifically talk about this window of time. So did that close off other feelings or experiences, or did it invite a little bit of both? What was that like?
It's, I guess, because it's not a first novel, it's much more deliberate. And I think this is like, for first novel, you have the experience of, let me put everything into it. And then you say, okay, well, this novel is only going to be about this particular landscape and this particular experience. So I was, I think, able to shut out many other inspirations and other voices. And at the same time, it is really a book about naming. And it's a book about coming up with titles for sort of random things in our lives, and to say, you know what, like this is a ritual, and you know what, like this person is our families. And the structure of the book is, naming everything as one would in fieldwork. These are kinship structures. These are, the modes of gift exchange, right, that an anthropologist might do. So in that way, it is much more on the page. But then, as we've talked about, there's so many things in the novel that are unsaid. And I think it just sort of comes naturally to me as a writer that I can't, on the one hand, I can't really imagine everything. So that's why a lot of things are unsaid. And sometimes when I do imagine something, I'll remove it from the page and say, I shouldn't have this much authority as a writer. Like, I should leave some space for the imagination of the reader. And the moment I remove it, I also sort of remove my own knowledge and say, I thought it was this way, but maybe it's not. And and also when you're writing fragmented novels, or when you're writing episodic novels, the little pieces are in conversation with one another, and there's a lot of like empty space between them for the unsaid and for the reader's imagination.
How did you come up with all those titles very quickly? There's like 90 titles in this book.
At first, I looked at like Triste Tropique or something, like a Levi-Strauss, and I just started writing down anthropological things, like anthropological modes of observation. And then it became a little gimmicky, and I thought I'll keep some of them, but then for the other ones, I'll just like, come up with titles that sort of match, but are a little bit like idiosyncratic.
Cool. Oh, now there's lots of questions.
Thank you.
Hi, I feel like this is a great segue for my question because I'm an anthropologist in training.
Oh no.
So,
Good night, everybody.
no, I love everything about this so far. So I actually wanted to ask you if there was a specific, you mentioned Levi Strauss, but I wanted to ask if there was a specific contemporary anthropologist or any work of anthropology that was your guiding light for writing this novel. Thank you.
So I have to also admit that I studied anthropology in college. So I was looking at my lots of college textbooks, and there was, weirdly enough, a book by Doreen Kondo. Do you know? Called Crafting Selves. It's about women factory workers in Japan. So I was looking at that book a lot. It has nothing to do with the novel, but I just wanted to remember that mode of thinking and that mode of extracting yourself from the subject, but then also being self-reflexive, trying to involve yourself in the ethnography, but also be, that constant tension of observation and subjectivity.
Okay, sure. Do you want me to hand it to you right after? Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Izzy. Thank you so much for being here. I really love this abstractness and the ambiguity that you offer in this book, and just this aspect of really allowing the reader to see themselves in it, because just in this entire conversation, I'm like, I've never felt so seen by these concepts, and I haven't even read the book yet, but just every single thing that you go through with the main female character and this pressure of having to make a commitment to a future self, or do I want to have kids? Do I want to do any of these things? And just putting it off so many times, just really allows so much of myself to come through while when I eventually read this book. But I am curious if there are any specific takeaways that you're hoping that the reader will come out with.
The hardest takeaway for me, which it's very difficult to know it at the time, that this is a very, very valuable and unique time in life. And it's a time when you're both a child and an adult. And to me, there was nothing like it. And it's this time of self-discovery and trying on different personas, different from college, just because you now have a job and you're now making a living, so you don't have to worry about those things. So I guess this takeaway is, besides all of the big questions, this is a very, very joyful time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was so beautifully said, because I keep saying, I feel like I'm the youngest and the oldest I'll ever be. And that was so well said. Thank you so much for talking to us. And I'm here with Izzy, I'm Shreya, and I still have to read the book, but I've perused it. And I was wondering, you talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, you talk about episodic storytelling, and the names Manu and Asya as well. Manu is, and I'm so sorry if I'm going to bias anybody who hasn't read the book, and I'm not sure if you know this, but Manu was the first man in Hindu mythology. So the first, the Adam equivalent. And when I was listening to you talk, this very much felt like a first man and first woman kind of a story. It could be seen from a mythological perspective. So I'm wondering if there are any influences from mythology that you carried with you when you were writing this book. Thank you.
Wow, great question. Adam, are there any mythological influences?
Well, they say to Asya, I named you after a continent. Why are you making a little documentary film?
Right. So Asya's name, I hadn't realized. For me, Manu was it could be, if it's Emmanuel, it could be, from one geography. If it's Manu, it could be from another geography. So I was going for that sort of ambiguity. And Asya is, it's Asia, the name of a continent, but she could be Balkan, she could be Middle Eastern, she could be Central Asian. That sort of, and therefore that level of abstractness, I guess, mythology functions in this way, that it's both abstract and it's a reflection of how people live and how people will continue to live. But I don't know probably I have, we all have mythological frameworks sort of ingrained in our ways of thinking and our storytelling, but I couldn't tell you one off the top of my head. That was a direct inspiration for the book.
And oddly, your next book, The Wilderness, is all about mythology.
Yes, it is.
Okay, we're going to end with a question from our online live stream audience. For those of us who are in the youth without responsibility or children or home ownership phase of our lives, how should we enjoy this anxious time?
Ooh.
Oh, goodness.
How to enjoy the time.
This anxious time.
Yeah. Oh, I want to know this.
I would say the thing is I have a very specific answer, and it sounds a little obnoxious, but I would say remove, don't be sarcastic. Don't be sarcastic about sort of these joys and the pleasures of being together, and say like, well, like we have to go to work tomorrow morning, or like we're adults now and we're no longer in college. Who cares about this like totally hypothetical? Like there's one scene in which they make a list of like the 100 attributes of a desirable person. And Asya's really annoyed because she's like, oh no, like this means we're going to stay up really late, and it means Ravi's going to miss the last metro, which means he's going to stay over. And that means we're going to like have this long breakfast tomorrow. And she already is slipping out of that, of the youthful, they call it the drinking spirit. And Ravi and Manu are really able to preserve it, and they're so in that time, and they're so unapologetic about it, which I really admire. And I would say that sort of unapology, no level of sarcasm towards your own ways of thinking or your own curiosities is something that I wish I had had.
Thank you, Ayşegül.
Thank you all for coming.
Oh my God, that was so great. Thank you so much. And if you want to get your books, just head out the back door there, and then meet us on the other side of the wall if you want to get it personalized. Thank you all so much for coming. We'll see you again soon.